If your main character doesn't directly shape how your story ends, they aren't driving the plot. They're just along for the ride. Welcome to Talk Beta to Me, the audio companion to the blog. I'm your host, Chris Chinchilla. Every week, we take the lessons learned from the editorial desk and break down the narrative speed bumps holding your fiction back. Today on the show, the Spectator Trap. Is your protagonist the hero of Act 3, or just a bystander with a front row seat? We're diagnosing why high-tension climaxes fizzle out and how to make sure your main character actively shapes the final showdown instead of watching from the sidelines. This episode was recorded live alongside a real-time audience on X. Stick around after the core craft reading, followed by our signature Something Weird trivia segment, where today we're looking at a bizarre 18th century trend for lawn ornaments. Let's head down to the live room and talk beta. The Spectator Trap. Is your protagonist the hero of Act 3, or just a bystander with a front row seat? I read a short story manuscript whose opening pages crackled with tension, but fizzled out because the protagonist faded to the background during the climax. Case study: when a high-tension premise loses steam. In Act 1, Arthur, a semi-retired marine biologist, is set to deliver a keynote address to wealthy benefactors of an oceanographic institute. His speech is meant to celebrate a major coastal cleanup project funded by the city's primary industrial sponsor. Moments before Arthur steps up to the podium, a young field researcher named Maya hands him a suppressed water sample report, revealing an uncomfortable truth. In Act 2, Arthur steps up to the microphone and drops a bombshell. The industrial sponsor's flagship factory was actually the primary source of the toxic runoff all along, and the celebrated cleanup project merely covered up decades of illegal dumping. The Institute's lead donor, Victoria, heir to the chemical fortune, is sitting right in the front row. The shocked audience pushes back on Arthur during the Q&A. Arthur admits the sample report requires official lab verification, but he is certain the data is genuine. In Act 3, the industrial donor, Victoria, the Institute's executive director, Marcus, and the young researcher, Maya, gather in a private office to discuss the fallout. Arthur watches as Victoria progressively accepts the damage to her firm's brand and agrees to fund a full environmental remediation project. Marcus worries about political pushback from the board, but since Victoria is willing to take the financial hit, Marcus can make the necessary structural changes to the Institute's conservation pledge, on the condition that Arthur writes the official scientific statement. Arthur quietly agrees. Maya is satisfied. Diagnosing the flaw. The passive protagonist in Act 3. You've likely spotted the problem already. Arthur becomes a spectator in his own story as the talking heads in the office resolve the primary conflict among themselves. At one point, I paused and looked carefully over the page I was reading for instances of Arthur's name. There were none. I backed up a page and found Arthur literally leaning against a filing cabinet, watching the others decide the facility's fate. 1. Zero risk equals zero stakes. Arthur is in no danger. Even if his professional standing takes a hit, and he finds himself uninvited from future paid consulting gigs, his retirement means he is financially secure. And nothing changes for Arthur if the Institute refuses to accept the corrected environmental report. He might be disappointed, but ultimately, he'll return to his golden years of quiet research and coastal leisure. 2. Irrelevance to the outcome. Further, if Arthur had shaken a few hands and headed home immediately after his speech, the office conversation would still have occurred. Arthur didn't gather them. Marcus did. Marcus asks Arthur to write the new environmental statement, but this request could have been made via email the next morning. While Arthur's credibility prompts Victoria and Marcus to take Maya seriously, they agree they'll move forward with remediation only after independent labs authenticate the samples, again making Arthur irrelevant to the outcome. Arthur told the truth in Act 2 and catalyzed the pivotal conversation in Act 3. But it's easy to tell the truth when there's no risk. If the protagonist risks nothing and affects nothing, they're not the hero of the story. They're a bystander with a front row seat. So, how do you actually fix a passive protagonist and build a high-stakes, crackling Act 3 showdown? That's next. Ready to query or self-publish? Hold that thought. My OnePass developmental editing service fine-tunes every aspect of your manuscript, from line-level syntax to the overarching plot. Head over to the services page at talkbetatome.com and mention the code BETA10 in your initial message to get 10% off and help your book toward its best shape. Crafting high-stakes climax mechanics. How to fix a spectator hero. How do we keep the story's tension crackling in the showdown? Make sure the protagonist has something big to lose and that they directly impact the climactic struggle. International Thrillers award-winning author James Scott Bell insists that all stories must have life or death stakes. That doesn't necessarily mean physical death. It can mean the death of a reputation, a lifestyle, or who a person is versus whom they need to become. Let's apply this to Arthur. Step 1. Inject real consequence. Act 2. Overhaul. Perhaps these private consulting gigs and board stipends pay for Arthur's expensive seaside cottage, which he might lose if that extra income were to dry up. During the audience Q&A session in Act 2, suppose a fellow scientist stands up and praises Arthur's world-renowned career, but insists his credibility will be destroyed for citing unverified field notes. Meanwhile, a benefactor funding Arthur's next private research grant walks out of the auditorium with a look that signals to Arthur that his funding is officially dead. Arthur imagines receiving foreclosure notices on his coastal home. The stakes are sky high for this retired scientist. His professional reputation is tanked, and his financial security is gone. Step 2. Make the protagonist the linchpin. Act 3. Overhaul. In Act 3, the talking heads discuss their issues, but this time, Victoria chafes. She needs political cover. She needs a scapegoat. She needs a respected figure to put their name on the whistleblower complaint and bear the brunt of the corporate lawsuits. Arthur's standing remains strong enough to take that blow. Will he do it? Now, instead of his eyes on them, all eyes turn to him. Marcus warns Victoria that Arthur will lose his entire consulting career if he signs the complaint. Victoria doesn't care. Either Arthur takes the legal hit, or Maya goes home empty-handed and the bay stays polluted. Arthur agrees to leverage his remaining clout to shield the Institute so that Victoria will fund the cleanup. Marcus asks if he'll be okay, and Arthur sighs, saying it was time to downsize out of that expensive seaside cottage anyway. A few tweaks inject much-needed tension into Acts 2 and 3 while protecting the manuscript's word count. It's interesting for a scientist to watch ecological history unfold, but it's far more engaging to see him actively shape it. In the falling action, Arthur sits at home drafting the official environmental report. He's losing his cottage, and his lifetime reputation is bruised, but his conscience is clear, and the truth is out. Story checklist. How to audit your own climax. A great opening won't save a flat ending. Take a look at your story and ask, are the stakes life or death, physically, financially, or personally? Does the protagonist affect the climax, such that if they hadn't been there, the result would have been entirely different? Make your story crackle from start to finish by giving the hero something to lose and ensuring the final moments depend entirely on them. It puts readers on the edge of their seats. And that wraps up the reading for the Spectator Trap. A few interesting points came up in the thread that was related to this yesterday. One thing that came up from user @GutCutter, he argued that in massive epics like sci-fi space battles or World War II novels, the plot itself is the main character, not a single person, because the scope is so big that the main character is not really going to affect the end of the war or the epic space battle. They're just one person. Now, of course, we've seen some epics where in fictional scenarios, one person does affect the outcome, or in historical scenarios, one person affects a partial outcome for maybe their squad in that World War II epic. But even when writing grand scale conflicts, the protagonist won't single-handedly win the war necessarily, and they probably shouldn't. It would be a little difficult to believe if it was only one effort. But we tend to experience the macro through the micro. So their personal survival, their squad relationships, or a targeted mission, they still need to directly influence their immediate corner of the world. And so what happens on this micro scale to this one character and their squad becomes the way that we understand the macro scale. They might not win World War II, but we see through them how many stories just like theirs resulted in winning World War II or winning that grand space battle. So even in scenarios like that, making sure that protagonist is key to their own story is important. There was also an interesting take in a couple of comments from the thread about Nick Carraway. We might call him the Spectator the protagonist or the narrator of The Great Gatsby, and how he doesn't really seem to affect anything. He's kind of held up as the ultimate passive protagonist. There's an interesting distinction to make, and it's probably a worthy topic for an entirely different conversation, that a narrative voice is not necessarily the same as a protagonist, and that would be the case in Nick Carraway's case. But even in The Great Gatsby, Nick is responsible for facilitating a lot of meetings or social gatherings, or interrupting them or impacting them in a way that drives events, even though he's not necessarily intending to. That leads to Gatsby's ultimate downfall and the results as they come out. Another great comment came from EJ. He gave a delightfully direct solution to keeping that passive main character active in Act 3, and his answer was very simply, piss him off. And that's a great point. When a character becomes passive, it's often because they're too comfortable or detached, and so forcing a personal insult or a betrayal or a threat turns them into an unpredictable wild card, sometimes even to themselves, and forces them to react passionately rather than logically and stand by and watch. I recall coming across a very simple example in a book on writing fantasy and science fiction that said, your hero does not necessarily have to fight the dragon at the end. They could be watching the knight fighting the dragon, but the key is that at a pivotal moment, maybe the knight is near defeated or severely wounded, and their sword is just out of reach. As long as the protagonist steps in and kicks that sword within reach of the knight so that they can deal the death blow to the dragon, they remain an active participant and the hero of the story, even though it's the knight fighting the battle. And of course, we see this as a metaphor, and and it could be applied to many situations. In this case, an oceanographer and a donor to the institute, they might be having it out, but our retired scientist comes in and offers that political cover we talked about, putting his reputation at stake. So that's a good way to look at it. But the point is that sometimes we get lost in setting up all these characters, and without even realizing it, our protagonist is quiet right at the very end, and somebody reading the book realizes that the outcome doesn't depend on them, and there's something that fizzles out about that. And that wraps up our live community session for the week. If you want to grab the mic yourself, ask a question about your current draft, or just hang out in the room with us, we broadcast live on X every single Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Daylight Time. Our next live session is Wednesday, July 29th, and I'd love to see you in the room. If you want to stop guessing if your pages are working and get an objective, disciplined eye on your manuscript, head over to talkbetatome.com to check out my one-pass developmental editing or book a one-on-one story strategy session. While you're there, be sure to check out our weekly blog posts and past episodes just like this one for more deep dives into narrative craft. And don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. Every month, you'll get a roundup of my latest editorial insights, plus an exclusive, subscriber-only look at part of a real manuscript showing my actual notes and the exact polishing edits we used to make it shine. Before we go, it's time for something weird. Did you know that in 18th century England, rich landowners paid people to live on their estates as ornamental hermits? They built fake, rustic grottos and hired men to move in, never cut their hair, and roam the grounds in ragged robes, literally serving as living, moody landscape decorations for visiting guests. Unless you're writing historical satire, nobody wants an ornamental hermit for a protagonist. Don't let your main character become a piece of scenery in their own climax. I'm Chris Chinchilla. Thanks for listening. See you next week.